Hello, everyone, and welcome to Free Your Mind with Dr. Sheena Mason. I am here to answer and respond to some questions that I've received on Twitter and in my Discord and across other platforms, and also to just chit chat with you. There's no strong plan for how this conversation will look today. I'm just going to see where it takes us. So one question that I got on Twitter was around how people should look at the theory of racelessness as it pertains to the theory of racelessness in practice. And essentially, it's a question of, number one, am I saying that social constructionists about race who are also reconstructionists about race, am I saying that they're unintentionally upholding racism? Yes, that's what I'm saying. Now, what a lot of people fail to recognize is that by my assessment and my assertion of that, it's not an indictment in the same ways that those same constructionists, reconstructionists might sling the term racist in somebody else's direction. It's more of a statement of fact. It is my conclusion that those people who believe that the concept of race and the belief in race should be maintained in some fashion or form, even those who are working to reconstruct the thing, are unintentionally upholding and allowing the same thing they say they want to dismantle or destroy. And by my own definition of racism, that practice and action of racializing human beings as being anything outside of simply and profoundly human is part of racism. So then the next question the person had was, would the author, so if applying the theory of racelessness to an article that this person was reading, if the author would be practicing racelessness if they had used language that interpreted what was perceived to be racial into more apt language, would they be practicing racelessness? Well, they might be practicing racelessness. Would they be practicing the theory of racelessness? Would they be applying the framework, the rules that come along with the theory of racelessness and the tool of race translation? Would they be doing that work? Presumably, yes, provided the language was more precise in terms of what was being identified, that racism itself, as well as culture, ethnicity, social and economic class, were not being conflated with that which was perceived to be as race or racial. If the author was avoiding the unintentional naturalization of race, then I would say that's practicing and applying the theory of racelessness, yes. One other strategy for, I guess, refusing to uphold racism by upholding the belief in race, it can be in some ways even more simple, right? It can include the use of the word racialized in front of a race language or race identifier. So racialized Black or racialized white, racialized Asian, and so on. Similarly, you could use the language such as so-called in front of that race language. You can, if it's in writing, you can put race language and the word race itself in quotation marks. There are a lot of other more practical steps that you can take, even as you work on improving your translation skills, to stop unintentionally upholding the problem of racism. And for many constructionists, it's the least one can do in terms of pointing to the problems that many constructionists readily identify, while also not contributing to the problem. And as it pertains to the identification of one's ideas or one's practices as somehow upholding racism or reflecting one's racistness. Making up words. Most people view that label, right, that attribute, as pernicious, as something that's inherently negative, that says something about a person's moral character. All of those types of things, like if you're racist, you're evil in a sense. But through my framework and just how I've come to look at the problem, and especially as it pertains to not just pointing out the problem, but solving and resolving the problem, that attachment of morality or badness or evilness falls away. So it truly isn't an indictment. It really is more of a matter of fact. And I encourage my students and people I work with to look at it similarly. I think it's because we attach morality and immorality to what it is to be racist that so many people reply vehemently to being called racist. And then it becomes more important for people to not be called or viewed or seen as racist than it is for those same people to actually not be racist. I really critique that and interrogate that line of thinking. And as much as possible, I invite other people who participate and engage with my theory to step outside of the bounds of what it is to be racist or what it is to not be racist or against racism and so on, with positive and generative results. Now, this person's other question actually goes along with the lines of what I said I would talk about next at the end of my last live stream. So let me dig in here. The person writes, I have another question. If someone is from Mexico or descended from Mexican immigrants, we might say he or she is Mexican or Hispanic. Those are ethnic and national terms and not race-based necessarily. They are clear and concise words commonly understood. Here in the US, we use the word Black to describe people who share culture, history, ancestry, and of course, the experience of oppression or discrimination from racism. In a way, it is an ethnic identity without a home or with a home that exists in contrast to the mainstream of American culture, though that is increasingly hard to define. Do you have a clear and concise term to describe this group to replace the word Black with a capital letter? So something I spoke about in my last podcast was this question of how many people conflate race and culture and ethnicity, thereby the capital B is signifying all of those things, some combination of all of those things. And if we really want to free ourselves from the strictures of racism, we have to do away with that language to describe culture and ethnicity, because part of the problem there is that racism continues to hide its face in the language, which influences and informs how people think about a thing, which influences and informs how a person acts about a thing. And if we want to get to the other side of racism, and if we want the healing that can come along with that liberation, then the language we have to do away with. And at the earliest stage of my journey, as it pertains to my own philosophies of race, I felt that, well, if I'm going to take away this language, right, if I'm going to take away race language as it's associated with in a place like the United States, then obviously I have to replace it. That was my thinking. And I remember one of the committee members on my dissertation committee was thinking along very similar lines. And the thought process at that time was, if anyone can come up with some magical language that gives people what they want, but doesn't unintentionally uphold the problem of racism, it's you, Sheena. And I remember feeling an immense amount of pressure to crack the code, because for me, what was at stake was the problem and the negative impact of racism. And I was very sincere in my desire to contribute in a positive way to the solution and future making as it pertained to that particular problem. So for a couple years, I was thinking along these lines of, okay, I've recognized now that what the literature and what the histories are showing me is that to undo racism, we have to undo race, which I've now revised to we have to undo our belief in race. But what what do we replace the word Black with to describe a sort of ethnic specificity and cultural specificity? And I kept running into a brick wall in a sense, because I couldn't figure out how to properly replace the thing. Now, once I shifted from a constructionist eliminativist perspective about race, I realized that what I was really convincing myself that I had to do was replace racism with something else, replace the language of racism with something else, which once I got to that point intellectually, I realized there's nothing that doesn't need to be replaced, right? There are going to be other hierarchies and ways in which we divide ourselves from ourselves, because that is part of the human story. But removing the violence of that way of dividing people as it pertains to racism, as it pertains to the United States, that's not something that needs to be replaced. Certainly, I won't be the person to replace that thing. Because what I came to recognize is that although people have for centuries now worked to reconstruct the meaning of Black, to extend it beyond its racial meaning, which is the same as saying to extend it beyond its racist meanings and underpinnings, the work that people have done as part of a reconstructive effort of race, thereby racism, has fallen short for all of the reasons that I talk about in virtually every single podcast and every single publication, which is that the language itself is tied to the history of racism in this country. And so nobody has successfully been able to crack the code and make Blackness something that it wasn't also connected with that same history and the traumas and the generational traumas that have been passed on because of that history. And so a lot of people, especially a lot of scholars, have convinced themselves that this sort of reconstruction of race through the reconstruction of Blackness and the extending of Blackness to be outside of, but also including race, that has been somehow a successful endeavor. And while that endeavor has given generations of people positive feelings about themselves and about other people as it pertains to racialization that weren't intended by the originators of this racist and racial ideology, because it's still tethered by the racist, i.e. racial ideology, that's why it still falls short. And that's why in the context of a place like the United States, the language just has to be done away with. And I would argue that we don't have to replace the language of racism with anything else. And one net gain of doing that work and embracing a new future, a new reality outside of the fishbowl of racism and being in the ocean, would be a proliferated understanding of culture and ethnicity that currently, because we continue to think about those two things in racialized terms, we're precluded from necessarily seeing or acknowledging. So with that in mind, I want to open up this definition of ethnicity, which I think is enlightening and helpful. Okay, so I just went to ethnicity definition, and we're going to use our good friend Wikipedia. Listen, say what you will about Wikipedia, but I find it to be very helpful a lot of times, at least as a good starting point, not necessarily an end point, but definitely a good starting point. So I'm really convinced that the people who edited this page for ethnic group listened to my podcast in the last 6 months and have revised their Wikipedia page accordingly, because just last semester, so in the fall semester, some of my students and I, we went to this page together because we were working on our definitions of ethnicity and race and all of the things. And so we go to this page and it was not saying everything that it's saying now. And then in the spring semester, which just concluded, and with a different class, but some of the same students from the other class from the fall, we did the same thing. We ended up going to the Wikipedia page, and my repeat students and I were like, what? This wasn't saying much of anything like this when we looked just a couple of months ago. These people must be listening to the Freer Mind podcast, or at least that's what I'm going to tell myself. So, ethnic group. An ethnic group or an ethnicity is a grouping of people who identify with each other on the basis of shared attributes that distinguish them from other groups. These attributes can include common sets of traditions, ancestry, language, history, society, culture, nation, religion, or social treatment within their residing area. Ethnicity is sometimes used interchangeably with the term nation, particularly in cases of ethnic nationalism, and is separate from the related concepts of races. And then it goes on to say that ethnicity may be construed as an inherited or as a socially imposed construct, that ethnic membership tends to be defined by a shared cultural heritage, ancestry, origin myth, history, homeland, language, or dialect, and symbolic systems such as religion, mythology, ritual, cuisine, dressing style, art, or physical appearance. Ethnic groups may share a narrow or broad spectrum of genetic ancestry depending on group identification, with many groups having mixed genetic ancestry, and ethnic groups often continue to speak related languages. So, a couple of things to notice here about this good old Wikipedia definition of ethnic group or ethnicity. Number one, that it should not be conflated with the concept of races. Okay. This part here, it should not be conflated with the concept of races. Though in American society, when people talk about Black as an ethnicity, some people will say that when they think of Black, or when they say Black, they mean specifically Black American, and that signification, or that way of talking about what could also be called as African Americans, that is just pointing to an ethnic or cultural difference. Now, I sometimes wonder how sincere that point is by people who would make that argument, considering the fact that Americans undoubtedly think about Black as signifying race. And there's virtually no distinction between what it is to be Black and what it is to be of African descent, period. And when you look at the literature and you look at the history and you look at public discourse and you study all of this, you come to see that although people will tell this story of Black is specifying a particular Black American ethnic cultural identity, that's an interesting way to frame it, to try to make it be a positive thing that just looking at it as race or racialization misses. But in terms of how the majority of people see Black and Blackness and what they think when and how they respond to those things as being inherently racial, I think that that's not something that people should miss, and that's not something we need to quote unquote reconstruct or revise, because there are too many misconceptions about what ethnicity and culture are that get continued even just by using the concept of Black as a so-called ethnicity or culture. What am I talking about? Okay, well, some people, when I say ethnicity, what they'll hear is race. So they'll still think Black, they'll still think white, and they'll also think the other things that are arguably actual ethnicities, such as Italian or Irish or English or Nigerian or Ghanaian or Trinidadian or Chinese or whatever. So in America, it's this weird paradox between people at once being able to recognize what ethnicity means and what ethnic groups are, and that there are various ethnic groups, even among groups that are racialized in the same ways, such as white or Black or Asian. And then the fact that because a lot of government agencies, because media, because the school books, because we're taught to see ethnicity and race as the same, somehow people also miss the entire point about their differences, which are profound and have value, and if we recognize it. Because the concept of race itself tends to homogenize or wash over ethnic differences. And ethnic differences should not continue to be mistaken for or as racial differences. And part of how we know this, as in my argument about the conflation and the error that people make, and why reconstructing Black to be ethnic or cultural only outside of race is an error. It's not going to take us where we say we want to go. If you look at the history of the concept of race, and you look at early modern European societies, you see that race back in the day, we're talking 1500s and even earlier, but to a lesser extent, the word race existed, the concept of race existed, and it did correspond with a hierarchy that was present in those societies. And it had absolutely nothing to do with how people were racialized in terms of Black and white. And it had everything to do with what people mistakenly think is white on white inhumanity or cruelness, like the kind that Whoopi Goldberg mistakenly spoke about on The View. Because at the earliest iterations of the concept of race, it was about different ethnic groups, different nationalities, different economic and social classes of people with different cultures who would have looked very similar, but who saw each other through that type of racialized framework. And the case could be made in other places, like on the continent of Africa. In Nigeria, you have different ethnic groups who will oftentimes look similar, not the same, but similar. And they'll have different cultures. They'll have different ancestry. They might have different religions. They'll eat different foods. They'll dress differently. They'll create different art. They'll have different dialects, all of that. And there will be division undoubtedly between some of those ethnic groups. But by the American concept of race, we miss the fact that that view of ethnicity that exists in other countries and has existed across time was a form of racialization, because it was rooted in the concept of race. And the concept of race it existed and continues to exist with the express purpose of dividing groups of people from themselves and from each other based on these other aspects that differed between these so-called ethnic groups, or the groups that were racialized. So when a person says that racism exists everywhere, in a lot of ways, that's a correct statement, because racialization exists everywhere, except part of the mistake that people make in that kind of assertion is assuming the racism exists and the racialization exists in the same exact ways that it exists in a place like the United States, which is not true. So this assertion that, oh, white supremacy is global, it's omnipresent, it's everywhere, I find that to be very pernicious for a lot of reasons, including the fact that if you understand that capital R race doesn't travel, it doesn't exist everywhere, and it has never existed everywhere, and God willing, it won't exist everywhere. But you understand that hierarchies, that different forms of oppression and division do exist for everywhere. I don't know if there's a paradise that exists on this planet. I would like to know about it. If anyone knows, feel free to let me know in the comment section. If you understand that, then you can start to get your head around what I say is the unrealness of race, and part of my evidence for why using language that's associated with racism, that is race language, to describe an ethnic group will continue to reap what we sow with that regard, because there's this deep, long-standing practice of racialization that is rooted in both ethnic differences and then what was rooted in what was described as racial differences, that continues to get carried through with that same language, that we cannot and have not, not only have we not been successful in decoupling the two and doing what some folks in my field call deconstruction, but the reason for that unsuccess is because of the fact that racism gets carried with the language. It just does. It created the language. So in the earliest iterations of race and race ideology, you have this practice of creating and maintaining and perpetuating a hierarchy. And in the context of what would become the United States, especially after 1760, you start to get anti-miscegenation laws, and you start to get slave codes and all of these things. And in the language of the law and in the public domain, you start to get the language of Black and white and of color that reflected the caste and class systems that were on the ground, that is chattel slavery. And it is that adoption of this early race language and the practice of racialization for similar purposes, because remember, Europeans had indentured servants, which were basically like enslaved people. They had caste and class systems among themselves, and probably they still do. Not an expert on today's Europe, but I imagine that is true, because there's no paradise on earth. that same framework then gets transplanted for the purposes of making race and racialization and making and maintaining the hierarchy that was already on the ground and justifying it. Now let's take the language, the words black and white, for example, and of color, all of that, that language existed already. And the language existed in a way that was a hierarchy, because whiteness was always associated with purity, right? And goodness and everything right in the world, positivity, light, God, Jesus, all the things, right? And black and darkness was associated with the exact opposite of what whiteness was. So let's take that language that people are already familiar with in terms of the good and bad, and let's translate it, plant it into this race ideology to try to justify in public domain the vileness that was chattel slavery. And in other places, if you study whether race and racism, if it travels, how it travels, if you look at a global context, you would see that racialization still tends to operate in the earliest ways in many other places, and arguably in places where the differences that people can point to are primarily and more often among people who look similarly. And when you have a country like the United States, because it is more diverse, and because it's increasingly diverse, and because people have lived here from different nations for centuries now, for a very long time, the ways and the primary ways in which we divide ourselves are based off of the phenotypical features and ancestry and DNA, based off of how we racialize people in the context of the United States. But that it doesn't work the same way everywhere else, in the sense that although the frameworks are similar in terms of the outcomes, in terms of the division, the language is different. And so therefore how it looks is different and how it operates is different. And one example I give is, if I go to Paris, France, a lot of people would say, I don't know if this, a lot of people, that might be an overstatement, but there are some people who would say that the French are the most racist people of them all, right? Okay. But yet then there are Americans like Toni Morrison or James Baldwin who go to these other countries like Paris, France, and they end up arguing that the privilege they receive because they're viewed as American in that context, and they're not viewed as so-called Black Americans or Black people, they're just seen as American. And that difference mattered to them, which is why they essentially fled the US and took refuge in Paris. That difference is notable. I don't see it as being an anomaly or the sort of exception to the rule, but then it's complicated by the fact that you might be from Nigeria and you might go to the same place and experience discrimination. And then the question is, well, is that capital R racism, like good old fashioned American racism? Or is that a practice of racialization? Or is it xenophobia? Is it some kind of hierarchy based off of where a person is from, as opposed to something else or anything else? Or is it a combination of all of the above? And I think that for the average person, none of this seems to matter. But as a philosopher, or as an imagined philosopher, and as somebody who takes the problem of race and racism very seriously, I think the differences in this knowledge matter, because how you see a problem is going to influence and affect how you solve a problem. or if you solve a problem at all. And if you see the problem of racism as just being omnipresent everywhere and always black versus white, etc., then not only are you missing reality, but you're missing reality in a way that continues to harm people and actually cause some of the negative effects caused by capital R racism that we're trying to get our heads around, that we're trying to transcend, that we're trying to stop, and that we're trying to heal from. And part of how racism has manifested itself in American society has been the fact that at the earliest stages of what became America, racialized white men were primarily the benefactors of what became the United States. They were the only ones that had the right to vote, right? They were protected by the law in every sense of the word, whereas other racialized groups and also women were not. Now, across time, people have pointed out the fact that American as a concept, as an identity, has been defaulted, the sort of default position or presumption of what American means or has meant. People have pointed out that it has meant white, and people have felt that it also has meant male. Now, on the one hand, I recognize the history because I am very aware of the history of this. And I can say that historically, that was closer to true. And at the same time, I would argue and contend that although that might have been true legally, up until the point where women earned the vote and racialized Black people were freed and earned a vote, up until those points in history, it seemed true that to be American was to be so-called white and male. But that assertion or that effort was a failed one because America has never been and likely will never be that. There were people on the ground, not just enslaved people, but they were indigenous people, there were free people of African descent, and there were Europeans. There were people virtually from around the globe who helped in the shaping and the forming of what would become the United States, who had fundamental roles in that process, and who, despite the best efforts of some people in keeping a pure culture and a pure race and all of that stuff, the things that people tried to accomplish, failed. Because you can't control the formation of culture. You can't control the fluidity of it. You can't control nation building in those ways. You can't control people having relationships with each other, having children, and DNA mixing. Like, you can't control any of that, even though a lot of people really tried to control all of that and tried to write all of the complexities of what was early America out of the history books. If you know the history and you understand how culture and nations are formed, and you understand ethnicity outside of racialized perspectives, then you come to recognize the fact that American, though plenty of people tried to make it white and tried to make it male, actually rightly describes those of us in the United States, regardless of citizenship, regardless of our skin complexion, regardless of our cultural inclinations, regardless of our DNA, regardless of any of that. And that, to me, that recognition, to me, is what honors my ancestors some of which were enslaved. They fought, lived, died, all of the above to be seen as fully human and to be seen as American. And it didn't take many generations for people to fight for that recognition. And because people fought under the banner of race ideology, that is, because people inherited the concept and the language of race and they saw themselves as Black, doesn't mean that that's how I have to see myself moving forward, or that's something that I have to inflict onto my children. Because although arguably there's nothing negative about being Black, there's everything negative about being racialized, and that matters. And so I contend that if we look at American as a descriptor for what happens with ethnicity in the United States, what happens with culture, by American culture, what happens with are shared as a nation, not as separate races within a nation, what happens with a shared history, what happens when we stop separating and insisting on distinctiveness based on racialization or based on the history of racism or the contemporary instances of racism. What happens when we stop doing all of that is we start to have a more clear idea of, and a more imaginative idea of what culture and ethnicity and what American can actually mean within the context of the states. And the fact that many people have fought to not be seen as second-class citizens, I think, is indicative of the kind of radical ways that I think of American and that I think of ethnicity, and that I look at American as a nation and as an ethnic group. And that the ethnic group is a conglomerate of DNA from all over the world. Whether people like it or not, that's the reality. And it's also a conglomeration of culture, because when you understand culture and ethnicity, you recognize it's not homogenous. You can be ethnically Chinese, but you can speak Mandarin, and you can have a culture that aligns with that, and you can have that history. But that doesn't change the fact that you see yourself as Chinese. And in a way, in the States, what we miss by racializing everything and having and insisting on language to describe culture and ethnicity that's rooted in the history of racism, well, for one thing, it perpetuates this idea that Black culture is separate from American culture, or it's not American culture, or it's less than, it's inferior, because the language is tied up with that. So there's that. But it also washes over what I would argue would be regional differences as it pertains to culture specifically. And it washes over social class differences and similarities that prove to be very problematic in upholding the problem of racism and upholding poverty and inadequate education systems and all of the things, because we want to racialize everything. And it washes over the ways in which, if you are from Houston, Texas, and you are racialized as any of the above or all of the above, you are probably going to sound the same. You're going to have the same accent. To me, it would be an accent, because I have an accent that's different from how folks in Houston sound. You're going to eat probably a lot of the same foods. You're going to be influenced and inspired by a lot of the same music, and you can participate in the creation of all of these things. And I think the sooner we can embrace that reality, then the sooner people can start to unify and heal around more positive understandings of what all of these things are about. And one of the last things I'll say about that aspect of it, there's this concept of multiculturalism or transculturalism. And I view that language and the ideologies that attend to that language as also perpetuating some of the problems that we speak against. Because it gives this sort of false impression that any culture is mono, right? It gives a false impression that any culture is singular, it's monolithic, and it's hegemonic. And I would be hard pressed to look at a map and find a place where that's true. Never mind the fact that culture changes over time. So, you know, the culture of America in 1800 is distinctly different than what it is today. And so no culture actually stays the same. And in that way, the cultural and thereby the ethnic ties that were severed because of the Middle Passage, there's something to be said about honoring that disconnection and recognizing it and acknowledging it and embracing that as the reality of what happened. And there's something to be said about being able to look and identify potential connections to those different ethnic groups as it pertains to remnants of culture, as culture gets change and change and change, and some things stay the same. There's something to be said about that. But I would also point out that people of European descent, though of their own accord, when they came over to what would become the United States, there was a severance between them and their home culture, and arguably their ethnic group as well, by extension. And that what was created in the United States was a distinctly different, separate culture. And even as we can look at American culture and say, okay, this is Italian, or this is English, or this is Jamaican, or whatever, even as we can do that, we could also just as easily pick a different point in time to go back on our family trees and say, aha, this is the spot where my people originated. And more often than not, depending on the century that you go back to, where your people originated is going to be different, which would then, by extension and by the way people tend to think about these things, then our ethnicity also is different and changes. And so your ethnic origins, the ways people think about that, I think of it more along the line of Edward Glissant's rhizomatic identity theory, in that all human beings have a sort of rhizome identity of various points of origin. And it's within the sort of racialized or black and white framework where people start to feel like they have only a single origin. And what I'm advocating for is a recognition of various origins that, when properly accounted for and reconciled, leads to the recognition of something entirely new that was created through the creation of the United States, that has only continued to create new over time, over the centuries. And that my own ancestors, depending on how far I go back, if I go back just 50 years, they're American. They're not anything other than American. They're American, which again, some people would hear that and say, oh, but people are different in America. Yeah, people are different in America. And if we have the proper conception of what it is to be ethnically or nationally American, then you would recognize that and stop making it a singular thing. Because making it a singular thing and feeling like everyone else has to get hyphenated or somehow, some kind of distinction has to be made, that's what continues the feeling of some kind of void for people, which has very detrimental impacts on people and has the unfortunate impact of allowing the separate and unequal to continue to persist. But it doesn't have to be like that. We could have more proliferated understandings of all of the aboves. We could have more radical and freer conceptions of ourselves and our children and our future generations. And we can do all of that while knowing and honoring the history. Well, I will say that if it's unclear to any of you still with me at this time, my ideas about all of this are very deep and very complex. And to communicate the depth of them in an hour is a ginormous task. But hopefully I said something here that sparks interest, something here that sparks a sort of aha, a questioning moment. Because ultimately that's what's going to get us all closer to what we want. Just being open to future making possibilities that are outside of even our own understandings. And for people who just can't get enough of anything I have to say, I intend to write more extensively about my conception of American ethnicity and culture in my second book. So you have something to look forward to. And in those same chapters, I will inevitably go into some of the background on how these concepts have been imagined up until this point, and my point of divergence and what I'm really calling for here. Thanks to any of you who were able to join me on the live stream. I will be back very, very soon. And in the